Forget the giant snakes. When you fall into that nightmare soup at 2 in the morning and you get that black water on you, and there's things going up your pants. There are insects in the water. There are tarantulas walking on the water, eating the frogs. It's like you are in a festival of sex and death. The jungle just gets into your skin. One girl got bitten like 16 times by this giant aquatic water spider thing. And they said in that book that over 100 people had died looking for him.
In our last video, we talked about the incredible expedition of Francisco de Orellana, who descended the Amazon searching for the fabled city of El Dorado, got to see and experience strange and highly developed hidden civilizations, and then ended up being ridiculed as a fraud and a liar. But before we talk about the newest discoveries that show that Orellana was in fact telling the truth, we have to give homage to the legacy of one of the most famous and tragic explorers of the South American jungle, Colonel Percy Fawcett. For centuries after the Orellana expedition, rumors kept circulating about long-lost cities in the Amazon and the riches hidden within. However, by the 19th century, mainstream thought rejected these stories as pure myth for a very simple reason. Every subsequent expedition that tried to retrace Orellana's steps found nothing except for extreme hardship and death. Still, there were some enthusiasts and explorers who were convinced that Orellana was right, and they devoted their entire lives to finding those lost civilizations. None of them was more famous than Colonel Percy Fawcett. Fawcett was born in 1967 in the English town of Torquay in Devon. He had a military education, served in World War I, where he got promoted to lieutenant colonel, and was also a member of the Royal Geographical Society. He lived a very interesting life, married, got 3 kids, and even befriended famous writers of the time. Most notable was, of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote his novel The Lost World based on Fawcett's reports. In the novel, Doyle talks about a specific volcanic plateau in the Amazon, which is where dinosaurs and prehistoric animals still live. The story is far-fetched, but it might have some credence to it. Fawcett's first ever expedition into the Amazon was funded by the Royal Geographical Society in 1906. But instead of finding lost civilizations no one really believed existed in the first place, his actual task was to map the area between Bolivia and Brazil, which was, of course, engulfed in a thick jungle. Supposedly, Fawcett saw and even shot a giant 62-foot anaconda, and he also found 2 new species of animals, but he was mostly ridiculed for these claims. Still, his efforts were fruitful, as he found the sources of the Rio Verde and Heath rivers. Around 1914, he first formulated his ideas of the existence of the lost city of Z. He believed it was hidden somewhere in the region of Brazil, known as Mato Grosso. Fawcett became inspired by Orellana's mission and the tales of hidden cities deep in the Amazon. But his beliefs were mostly based on Manuscript 512, a document detailing the discovery of ancient ruins somewhere in this region back in 1753. Supposedly, there were stone buildings with arches, a statue, and even a temple with some form of hieroglyphics. Like in all good mystery novels, the exact location was missing. But the information was enough to send Fawcett on what is to become his lifelong quest. Through his research, he became convinced it was his destiny to find the lost city he referred to simply as Z. He spent the next 2 decades looking for the place. Although he was briefly interrupted by the pesky World War I, Fawcett returned to the Amazon in 1920, and again in 1925. The latter one would become his last expedition. Fawcett's last expedition was funded by a London group called The Glove. This time, he was accompanied by his son Jack and his best friend Raleigh Reimel. Their last location was called Dead Horse Camp. Fawcett decided to go on an expedition with his son and friend, leaving the others in camp. That way they would be less likely to be perceived as a threat by the local tribes. They went into the jungle and no one has heard from them again. Theories ranged from them being killed by indigenous tribes to deciding to live out the remainder of their lives in the jungle. But this story was not yet over, and there are some plot twists up ahead. Supposedly there were 4 tribes that were the primary suspects behind the disappearance of Fawcett and his team. but the main blame was put on the Kalapalos tribe, which were the last ones to see them. In 1951, there was an indigenous people activist who met with the tribe, and this was their story. Supposedly, Fawcett and his group had an accident on the river and lost all the items that were supposed to be given as presents to the local tribes. Going into their territory without gifts was considered a great insult, so they killed the crew. John and Riley were thrown into the river, and only Fawcett, being an older gentleman, was given a proper burial. The activist was even given a pile of human bones, supposedly Fawcett's. Eventually, it was determined that the bones could not belong to the famed explorer. In a 1998 interview, an explorer named Benedict Allen interviewed the Kalapalo tribesmen, and they admitted that the bones were not Fawcett's and that they had nothing to do with his disappearance. So we're back to square one. Possibly the most plausible theory about Fawcett's disappearance was given in the book The Lost City of Z in 2009 by author David Gran. If you want to read it, I'll put a link down below. And who knows, I might do a special video on Gran too. It's a real-life story of a proverbial geek who's afraid of snakes, and who sometimes even gets lost on the subway while on his way to work. And somehow he ends up in the Amazon, which is probably the deadliest jungle in the world, trying to find out what happened to Fawcett. Gran even finds the ruins of an ancient city that might have been the one Fawcett was so desperate to find. By the way, both of his books, The Lost City of Z and Killers of the Flower Moon, were adapted into Hollywood blockbusters, with the latter probably headed for the Oscars. In the end, Fawcett never found traces of advanced civilizations other than meeting indigenous people on his travels. They were mostly ordinary people living in small villages. It was a far cry from the huge stone cities and massive populations that he was hoping to find, and it is no surprise. Modern scholars theorize that in Fawcett's time, only a few 100,000 people were living in the entire Amazon. If you remember from the previous video, new findings seem to suggest that in Orellana's time, there were millions, but 90% of them were decimated by illness brought in by the conquistadors. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, you really need to check out my previous video on Orellana's insane Amazon adventure. Even despite his numerous setbacks, Fawcett was sure that he would eventually find the lost city of Z. He was so sure of it that in the last letter he wrote to his wife, he told her that she need not fear any failure. With each perilous step he made in the Amazon rainforest, he probably expected to see the massive stone walls emerge from the dense canopy. Who knows? Maybe he even found them, just never lived to tell the tale. Join me next time when we explore the new evidence that shows that Francisco de Orellana really did see marvelous stone cities deep in the Amazon jungle, and that Fawcett was most likely just a step away from finding the lost city of Z. Also, make me happy and subscribe. See you next time.